My presentation tonight is entitled Bullethead, or the Birth of a Tactical Gun Culture. In my story, the letter A will be figured by its absence or trace to make a connection to Evie's poem. True story. The afternoon was probably hot and sunny that day since some of the boys were at a local swimming hole, and March afternoons in Laredo, Texas can get into the 80s, if not higher. Laredo sits right on the border in southern Texas. In 1931, it had only one bridge that crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico. There are four now. The bridge was completely destroyed by flooding a year later in 1932, as it had been in 1905 and would be again in 1954. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, this area is referred to as the Laredo sector, and it encompasses 110,000 square miles, 116 counties, and covers Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Harlan's father, Horace, was working as a Border Patrol agent that day in 1931, probably on duty at the bridge, when his son Harlon came home from school and his mother told him about the Mexican boys that had been hanging around that day. According to court documents, the Carter family car had been stolen 3 weeks earlier, and Harlan's mother was suspicious of the boys she saw that day. At the time, over 90% of the residents in Laredo were Mexican or Mexican-American. That made it actually one of the least diverse cities in the country, and it still is today. This is not surprising given that 80 years prior it was Mexican territory. Horace Carter was among the first cohort of 450 U.S. Border Patrol agents in 1924 and was transferred to Laredo after a purge of the Mexican-American officers there in 1927. The purge was a result of an inspection by the chief of U.S. Border Patrol, Clifford Perkins. Perkins had distrusted the officers in Laredo. The only Anglo on the police force was the chief himself, he wrote in a report. To solve this problem, he waged what he called a full-scale house cleaning by firing or charging half of the officers at the station with crimes. He then transferred Anglo officers from other towns to fill those positions, which brought the Carter family to Laredo. Harlan had joined the NRA in 1930 when he was just 16. His father, Horace, had instilled in him a love of shooting from a young age, and he would go on to win dozens of national marksmanship awards. The 17-year-old was therefore already very familiar with firearms when he picked up a shotgun that March afternoon in 1931 and headed out the door in search of the Mexicans that caught his mother's eye. In court documents, Harlan testified that he found the boys returning from a swim and shotgun in hand, ordered them to come with him for questioning. The oldest among them, 15-year-old Ramón Casiano, was the first to respond. "Hell no, we will not go to your house." According to 12-year-old Salvador Peña, who was there at the time, Ramón added, "And you can't make us," and he pulled out a knife. Harlan pointed his shotgun at Ramón's chest, which Ramón then brushed aside with a laugh and took a step back. Outraged, Harlan responded, "You don't think I'd use it?" Before Ramón had a chance to say a word, Harlan shot directly into his chest, killing the 15-year-old boy on the spot. Harlan was indicted, convicted of murder, and sentenced to no less than 3 years in jail. However, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the conviction in December of that year because the presiding judge was said to have not properly instructed the jury on the law of self-defense. The charges were dismissed nearly 2 years later in January of 1933 because, according to the state's attorney, quote, "several of the material witnesses, including that 12-year-old boy, have been discredited, having been convicted of infamous crimes." So just as the Mexican-American Border Patrol agents were purged to make room for their Anglo counterparts, so too were these Mexican-American boys criminalized to undermine their credibility in the court of law. Later that year, in 1933, Harlan enrolled at the University of Texas under a slightly different name. The second A in Harlan was changed to an O. in order to bury his connection to Ramón Casiano's murder. It was this Harlon Carter who would become the future head of the U.S. Border Patrol, commander of the notorious Operation Wetback, and the most consequential leader of the NRA in its history, serving as its president and then, more importantly, executive vice president. That's where the real power lies. When a New York Times reporter confronted Carter with the truth 50 years later and a few days before Carter was up for re-election as vice president, he emphatically denied it. It was a case of mistaken identity, he said, noting the slight difference in the spelling of Harlon. He publicly conceded the truth a few days later after his election to another 4-year term in 1981. At the time, writes Osha Gray Davidson, Carter was to the NRA faithful Moses, George Washington, and John Wayne rolled into one. When Carter retired, the NRA produced a 30-minute film commemorating his leadership and lifelong membership and screened it at a celebratory dinner. In the film, there was a close-up of Carter's original NRA membership card, which he received when he was 16. The name on the card read Harlon with an O, but you could see a trace of the original A underneath it. Interlude, Cincinnati, 1977. The NRA we face today was born in 1977. Yes, former Union Army officers chartered an organization in New York State in 1871 to promote marksmanship, and they expanded to promote shooting clubs and competitions in the interests of hunters over the next century. But it was the Confederate spirit and the logic of the border that animated the NRA after 1977. At their Cincinnati convention that year, the executive board proposed to sell the NRA headquarters in D.C. and move to Colorado Springs, reversing course on some of the recent lobbying and returning to the NRA core concerns of shooting sports and marksmanship. This sparked a rebellion by a hardline faction led by Harlon Carter, by then nicknamed Bullethead. And the rebellion turned into a coup. The board was removed. The plans to move the headquarters were scrapped, and Carter was elected executive vice president. In his victory speech, Carter declared, "Beginning in this place and at this hour, this period in NRA history is finished." That year, Carter hired Wayne LaPierre as a lobbyist and Robert Dowlut as a lawyer. Dowlut would become the NRA's general counsel and was instrumental in promoting an individualist interpretation of the Second Amendment that was eventually accepted by the Supreme Court. As it happens, Dowlut was also a convicted murderer. That was also not revealed until 2014. He murdered a woman in her 30s with a handgun in 1963. This new post-1977 NRA took an absolutist position on gun regulation and promoted a radically individualist interpretation of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, which had never been controversial, much less political, became the rallying cry of an authoritarian movement that deputized white men as sovereign subjects, authorized to patrol various kinds of borders and enforce the laws of their own making. Theoretical reflections, lawlessness, and self-defensive subjectivity. And here I'm just going to introduce kind of two reflections on the story. I can't flesh them out. They're just to add to our conversation tonight. Much has justifiably been made of W.E.B. Du Bois's insight about working class disunion. The theory of laboring class unity, Du Bois wrote, rests upon the assumption that laborers, despite internal jealousies, will unite because of their opposition to exploitation by the capitalists. Du Bois's explanation for the historical record of failure of this theory, which it obviously is a failure, was that white workers, although receiving a low wage, were, quote, compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage, end quote. Although attention is often paid to the psychological or subjective dimension of this insight, namely the sense of superiority that an ideology of white supremacy supplied in lieu of economic justice, it is the public or objective wage, however, that interests me here. To explain this public dimension, Du Bois described how, quote, police were drawn from their ranks, the ranks of white people, and the courts, dependent on their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness, end quote. Such leniency became the norm and thus a characteristic of white identity itself. It was a form of authorization synonymous with whiteness. And it meant that whiteness became an identity of both law enforcement and lawlessness. It could be seen as an instantiation of sovereignty, understood as the capacity to decide the exception. Walter Benjamin made a similar point about the police, under whose authority the separation of lawmaking and law-preserving violence is suspended. Du Bois stated this even more succinctly. White men become a law unto themselves. That is to say, in addition to being authorized to make and enforce the law as police officer, border patrol agent, or simply a good white guy with a gun, the privileges of whiteness also include being relatively exempt from it, in contradistinction to other groups. Indeed, the condition of otherness in this case is to be subject to unpredictable violence of white sovereignty. This vulnerability, like violence, is a mechanism of racial formation. And I'm not even discussing gender formation in this presentation, but many parallel observations could be made. We find these mechanisms at work in the story of Harlon Carter, a 17-year-old who already assumed he was authorized to take others into his custody at gunpoint, who would commit murder because that law enforcement authority was met with ridicule and resistance by Ramón Casiano. A judicial system that showed leniency and thus also reproduced the structural vulnerability of Casiano, and the criminalization of the Mexican-American border agents and the witnesses to Harlon Carter's crime. This revoked their authority to enforce the law or undermined their epistemic authority to determine what is and is not lawful. This is not a new phenomenon, of course. The Second Treatise of Government, so influential in American thought, by John Locke, authorized colonists in a state of nature to act as agents of law enforcement who could punish, dispossess, enslave, or even kill indigenous others thought to violate natural law. And the U.S. never conformed to Max Weber's idea of the state having a monopoly on violence. Settler colonialism and slavery devolved the power of sovereignty to white property owners for centuries. In practice, and from its inception, popular sovereignty has meant the state's production of spaces of rule for one group to dominate another, directly through coercion and extra-legal violence, or indirectly through dependencies produced by property right. My point, then, is not that this is new, but rather that we should locate the NRA and the social movement it is leading within this tradition. It is a reactionary movement, attempting and succeeding at transforming cultural norms, institutional practices, and the legal order itself in order to reproduce the conditions in which this pernicious form of social identity can flourish. An individualist interpretation of the Second Amendment has been central to this effort because it formally grants some sovereign powers to the individual, deputizing them as an agent of violence wherever they find themselves. In many states, this has achieved even greater formalization in the Stand Your Ground doctrines. This brings me to my second and final theoretical reflection, which concerns the absolutist and authoritarian notion of freedom at the center of this sovereign subject, this good guy with a gun. Judith Butler insightfully analyzes this subject in terms of injurability. The mark of sovereignty is to be the one not impinged upon by others, the one who denies their own constitutive injurability by relocating the capacity to be violated elsewhere. Another hallmark of this sovereign subject is the disavowal of the social conditions of its own freedom. Freedom is associated with abstract natural right and radical independence. If the subject were not completely independent, it would be permeable and vulnerable. Today's sovereign subject is fundamentally self-defensive. perpetually on guard against not just violence and thus injurability, but also any form of dependence whatsoever. George Yancey speaks of the illusory construction of the white subject as a self-contained substance. For this kind of subject, freedom can be purchased only at the price of the freedom or sovereignty of another. But as Butler indicated, this is an impossible condition, which is why it is stuck in a position of permanent vigilance and crisis. Like Harlon Carter's name, our structural vulnerability and mutual dependence can be denied, but it cannot be erased. Thank you.